Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining AIA California's first webinar of 2025, Resilience in the Evolving Standard of Care Series Part 2. New Standard of Care includes integrated resilience design. As you get settled, please feel free to say hello and where you're joining from in the chat today. To qualify for continuing education credit, AIA California provides the learning objectives for every webinar and includes them in the PDF presentation that can be made available online. We will provide links in the chat box where you can find upcoming and on-demand climate action and ZNCD webinars from AIA California. A few housekeeping reminders. Today's session is being recorded and qualifies for 1.5 AIA HSW learning units. For those who stay on and watch live, AIA California staff will report these units for you. Please use the Q&A function to ask any questions for today's presenters. You can also like a question to move it to the top of the queue. Please be constructive in your comments and questions to help foster a positive learning experience for everyone. Finally, AIA California's climate action programming is now brought to you by Arup. Sustainable development is everything. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for today. Gail Napel, AIA Lead AP BD+B. Gail has a breadth of expertise in educating the public and the profession in climate change risk assessment and adaptation, and also advocates for more progressive climate mitigation and adaptation policies. Gail, we're so happy to have you today, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in this timely topic today, and welcome to the course. Our instructors today are, next slide, please, me, and my house has been solar electric for 21 years, and I'm highly skilled at darning socks. Erin Feeney, AIA, with David Baker Architects, is a sustainability lead and frequent speaker on net zero and resilience topics. Erin got rid of her car in 2014 and has lived a car-free lifestyle ever since. Amanda Barton, AIA with HKS, co-author of the AIA Resilience Design Toolkit. Amanda upcycles her old clothes to make new ones and grows her own herbs, fruits, and vegetables. Sammy Shams, AIA, also with HKS, high-performance building and resilience expert. Sammy converted his car to run on ethanol and composts his yard debris and food scraps at home. After a hurricane, he has a lot. Tim Kohut, AIA, National Community Resilience, high-performance buildings expert, especially multifamily housing. Tim is an e-bike and e-scooter rider who subscribes to the 1 watt at a time sustainability approach. The first PV panel he installed 30 years ago was a 90-watt panel feeding a 12-volt car battery wired to 2 incandescent light bulbs. And Reeves Taylor, FAIA, with Gensler. Reeves has decades of experience in leading projects and teaching sustainability and resilience. And in the last year living in Texas, Reeves personally experienced flood, derecho, hurricane, tropical storm, sub-freezing temperatures, the 3rd highest snowstorm in history, fire, and drought. So next slide, please. We're acutely aware that the climate change crisis is an existential threat in the true sense of the word. Our current federal administration is catapulting backwards on this issue. But here's the thing. We as architects have outsized agency to help solve this crisis. With 37% of current CO2 emissions coming from the construction sector, our work has massive potential to mitigate carbon emissions. And we can design every single one of our projects to adapt to climate change. Today, we'll discuss how to identify those climate risks that impact your project and how to use that information so your designs address those risks. Next, please. The AIA Hazard and Climate Risk Guide and Form are available at the link that Sarah will drop in the chat if you'd like to open the PDF and follow along as we go. So next slide, please. Let's dive in. Step 1 is to establish the project building service life. I'm going to read this because it's important. The building service life is the assumed period for which a building or part of it is to be used for its intended purpose, with anticipated maintenance, but without major repair being necessary. The hazards and climate risks your project will experience are directly linked to how long that project will exist. So it's important to establish the building service life at the outset. Clients don't always include a building service life in their project requirements, or if they do, they may say it's the length of the lease or the length of the mortgage. That translates to between 5 and 30 years, which doesn't make economic or environmental sense. For example, consider the lifespan used in life cycle analyses for an EPD. Some products may be based on a 10-year lifespan, but most are around 60 years. This is a serious disconnect with a 30-year building service life. Jurisdictional requirements may dictate the minimum service life for your project, especially for critical facilities such as hospitals and schools. If you need a starting point for determining a reasonable building service life, there are reliable resources available. Our AIA COAT super spreadsheet includes recommended building design lifespans, which are indicated on this slide. So, for example, if your project is concrete, steel, or heavy timber, assume the project building service life should be at least 100 years. You'll assess local climate impacts for the next 100 years. The Carbon Leadership Forum website has guidance on recommended lifespan for various building components. And ISO 15686, which is the standard for building service life planning and is linked in the AIA guide, provides excellent assistance, but it is behind a paywall. The key point here is there are resources you can rely on for establishing your project's building service life. Next, please. And in the form, item 1 is the building design service life and design date. So next, please. The goal of step 2 is to understand at the most granular level possible which climate-related and other hazard risks are most likely to impact your project during its service life. Many jurisdictions have local hazard mitigation plans or disaster risk management plans that will tell you what the local climate-related hazards are. In California, these are typically available at the regional, state, county, and municipality levels. Also in California, all our municipalities are required by state law to have a climate change action plan, and that will definitely include projected climate change hazards in that municipality. Local utility districts, transportation authorities, and even school districts often have their own plans as well. Many of these plans have been legally adopted by local authorities having jurisdiction, so they're actually part of project code compliance. Sometimes building officials are unaware that these plans contain legally required resilience and adaptation features, but that doesn't relieve us as building professionals of the responsibility to know what these requirements are and to design to meet them. On the left is a screenshot of the landing page for the San Rafael Hazard Mitigation Plan where I live. It's a city of just under 60,000 people. The snip on the right is the table of locally identified hazards, the hazard risk profile for our city. There are additional resources hyperlinked in the AIA guide to help you cross-check your local plans to make sure they do include the climate change hazard information you need. The key point is many, if not all, jurisdictions have already identified local hazards, and they do typically include climate change risks. So next, please. In the form, item 2 is this primary sources of hazard risk identification, whether it's a local hazard mitigation plan or climate change action plan. Next, please. Step 3 is reviewing and, if necessary, refining the hazard risk profile for your project. These profiles are part of those local plans. On the left is the example from the AIA guide. The City of San Rafael example on the right is more granular, but contains the same key information: hazard type, assets impacted, a risk analysis, and a summary of the vulnerabilities. Next, please. The AIA guide lists the natural and human-caused hazards to identify for your project, which include but aren't limited to atmospheric, climate change, geologic, technological and anthropogenic, and biological and pathogenic. Local hazard mitigation plans typically also include the following information: scenario associated with each risk, for example, 500-year flood, probability of the future hazard event occurring, more about statistical probability in a minute, expected frequency of a given hazard event, guidance on the impact or consequences to your project, including cascading effects, the risk rating. This summarizes the vulnerability by ranking the hazards according to impact, probability, warning time, duration, and cascading effects, and the source and date of the documents that provided this information to the plan. For example, an IPCC report, NOAA, state data, etc. The resources hyperlinked in the AIA guide are helpful to use in addition to these local plans. They may identify a very real hazard that isn't reflected in local plans. Extreme heat is the one I most often see omitted from local plans, even though most of the United States is already experiencing this, not next century or next year, but now. The key point is, local hazard mitigation plans provide excellent information on climate-related risks, but as a design professional, you also need to leverage other science-based tools. And unless your project is in a polar region, you probably should design it to accommodate extreme heat. Next, please. And let's talk about 100-year events. For example, a 100-year flood. In year 1 of a project life, the probability of that flood occurring is 1 in 100. But every year, the likelihood increases. During a 50-year building service life, there's a 40% probability that the project will experience a 100-year flood. However, these stated probabilities are typically based on historic events and don't include climate change. So as they say with the stock market, past performance is not an accurate indicator of future events. So the key point is the probability of a 100-year event happening during the course of a project is way more than 1%. And remember, 100-year events are typically based on historic records, which do not reflect future or even current climate change conditions. And here you'll see the hazard risk profile item in the form that is in the guide. And so next, please. Oh, sorry, that one was supposed to go with the slide. I forgot about that. So next, please. Step 4 is to research the climate changes that are projected to occur during your project's building service life. Local plans will typically reference these future climate change conditions, as we mentioned before. To see the anticipated climate changes for your project location, you can also consult science-based tools that use the most recent IPCC report. But a heads up here. Take note of which IPCC scenarios the local plans are using for their basis. The best case IPCC scenarios are no longer viable. Without immediate decarbonization on a global scale, and let's be honest, how likely is that? The mid-range IPCC scenarios are probably also off the table. High future scenarios, for example, 4.8 degrees Fahrenheit average higher temperatures by 2100 are likely and may even be insufficient based on the current rate of warming. On the screen here on the left is a snip from some of the items shown in the AIA guide as resources. On the left is the 5th National Climate Assessment, and on the right is the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. And next, please. California has even more granular data to further refine results down to the city or even individual property level. The key here is to understand that local plans may not cover some of the most likely climate change impacts to your project, so do cross-check with these science-based tools. On the left, a resource from State of California, CalAdapt, which covers a number of climate change impacts. And then on the right, our CoStar Future, which maps sea level rise at a granular level along all of the coast. The key point here is, as a design professional, you need to know how the climate is likely to change over the course of your project's design service life. So next, please. In the form, item 4 is future climate conditions. And next, please. Step 5 is to pull it all together, similar to a traditional code search, and to document the resultant project resilience performance requirements. They'll include all the items you see listed here on the screen. And note here, a reminder that these local plans, hazard mitigation, climate change, etc., are part of project requirements, even if the local building department is unaware of them. And we want to emphasize that you should emphasize to your client, they've been told what the project climate risks are. If AHJs don't require design and construction to adapt to the future climate, and your client decides to ignore future climate because the code doesn't require them to build to it, you want to be on record that you warned them of potential issues. Next, please. In the form, item 5 is the project resilience performance requirements. And next, please. The last item in the form is project team acknowledgements. Here, everyone on the project team signs to show that they participated in the risk assessment and understand implications to the project. And next, please. Oh, item 7 is just additional notes you can add in your form. And now Erin will show us how to talk with clients about resilient design strategies and establish priorities to address the risks you identified with the guide.
Thanks, Gail. All right. Now that Gail has shared the AIA tool, I will take some time to briefly share how we at David Baker Architects are approaching these conversations with clients in terms of tone, timing, and our process to set and track these project-specific priorities and mitigation strategies. Next. So this is really an opportunity to find values alignment with clients that's going to support key decisions and investments to create resilience that you want to establish as early on in the project process as possible. So we like to talk about, and for our office, we're doing a lot of housing, but we like to talk about this in terms of people and operations and things that are really relatable for clients about their buildings. Next. And so, like I said, it's really important to talk about these resilience issues as early as possible, and then to continue these conversations throughout the design process. We're often handed sites and programs that we make the best of as architects. And so I think the challenge to us is to find more opportunities to be involved as early as possible in feasibility studies and site analyses when we can, but then to really make sure that those analyses are happening right up front. And that you're talking early on about mitigation strategies and able to track that through into design decisions, consultant coordination, getting those into bid documents, and then making sure that those are realized throughout construction. Next. And so any project is going to have unique strengths and vulnerabilities. And so Gail talked a lot about that process in terms of the AIA form, but just making sure that you are using data, science-driven, future-looking data, and maps as local as possible, just to reiterate Gail's points that help prioritize these risks and align on the goals with clients and make sure that you're giving visibility to all of that. Next. And then often we find that clients have a really strong desire to prioritize whatever events are most fresh in their mind. So they're looking to recent experiences. For example, the Orange Sky Days that we had in 2018 following the Camp Fire, every client meeting, people were talking about air filtration, and then that goes away for a while and people aren't asking for it as much. And fire resilience in California is likely going to be the buzzword for the rest of this year. But we want to make sure that we're not just reacting from an emotional standpoint about the most recent, and definitely not looking just to past data, but really looking ahead and having those conversations about likelihood. Next. Which is why the process of mapping vulnerabilities is really critical. There's so many resources out there. I think Gail did a good job of sort of simplifying that, but there's really tons of information, tons of data out there, and the goal is to find reputable sources that are as site-specific and future-looking as possible to get beyond those sort of personal, emotional experiences. Next. And so because there are so many resources, I've been part of a group through the Building Green Peer Networks that's been working to collect a crowdsourced centralized database of resources. We have been in conversations with AIA to figure out hosting and maintaining this long term. But right now it's just all of us putting the things out there that we are finding and vetting them as a group. And so this is available via the link that's posted here. There are location tags, there are types of hazard tags, and so it can be a helpful way to sort of crowdsource and share ways to get more local data. Next. And here's a link to add to that database if you're interested. If you have something that you're not seeing on there that you're personally using, we are still in the crowdsourcing trying to grow this database to help people find the most local resources available. Next. So as you begin these conversations, just a reminder that it's important to establish the scale of the resilience measures that you're trying to achieve with the client. For us, in housing, we're focusing on what are we trying to do at a resident level, a common area level, and then would there be opportunities to connect beyond the site? Next. And so sort of before this AIA form came out, we had been developing a matrix that's helpful to facilitate and track these conversations around likelihood and priorities, which could also be done with the form, but just that concept that you're documenting and sort of establishing that up front. Next. And that this is just, whatever documentation you're using, it's a central and shared location for the project team to track the status. And so as these conversations go on over the life of the project, you're able to say what's included, what's under consideration, what's not included, and have some notes about what you're doing to address the prioritized risk. Next. And one of the most important things that we've been learning in our conversations with clients is that they're really the most productive when you talk about resilience in terms of human experience, needs, and behaviors, and takes the big picture idea and makes it much more relatable, especially as you start to talk to service providers and maintenance staff and talking to them about their experiences and their needs, and the needs of the people that they're working with really makes this a much more relatable conversation. Next. It can also be really helpful to track the various incentives. There are some out there right now. There are more being developed, but ways that can reinforce with funding applications, with insurance, and there's going to be more case studies that talk a little bit about that as well. And that is all for me. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to give a brief run through of the Resilience Design Toolkit, which HKS co-published with AIA National and collaborated with the AIA RAD-AG. And as noted, our team gave a full presentation on this as the first part of the series. So I'll do my best to give a brief summary. And I just put a link in the chat if you would like to follow along. Next. As most of us know, the building code represents the minimum performance requirements a project must have to be built, and it seeks to provide a building that protects the health, safety, and well-being of users in hazard egress events, but does not ensure the building or structure will be usable after the event. A beyond code building must look to the future and anticipate potential changes in social behavior, technology, and climate to enable the building to remain relevant and safe over time. Next. So resilient architecture focuses on creating buildings and urban spaces that can continue to function and provide essential services during and after disaster events. So how do we get there? Next. Our team developed the 5 forms of resilience to communicate a comprehensive approach for resilience thinking, which includes social, health, economic, infrastructure, and environmental resilience. Together, these concepts provide a framework to assess the level of resilience of a place and reveal potential gaps where attention is needed. Next. The toolkit was developed through internal research and the evaluation of the wide breadth of tools, processes, and rating systems available to inspire resilience in the built environment. There are plenty of tools out there, but none truly address the architecture design process in detail. So we created our own and specifically crafted it for architects, interior, and urban designers. Next. The 5-step method embraces the standard approach for architecture projects that use in the AEC industry, which allows the process to be flexible, agile, and able to accommodate any type of project. Next. So where do we start? Step 1 is designing for resilience is to define the resilience scope of the project. This may already be embedded in an RFP, RFQ, or it may stem from a conversation or meetings with clients and stakeholders. And during your interactions, you will likely notice the knowledge level regarding resilience of a client, and that can help determine how to continue. Next. So once the resilience scope has been defined, the project team needs to be established. In step 2, the toolkit becomes a guide on determining who the players need to be, what role they will play, what additional deliverables may be necessary, and how it's incorporated into the typical work plan or job costs. Next. Once the team has been established, work needs to be done to align the group around the scope and priorities of the resilient design in the project. And the toolkit provides a framework of suggested key meetings to achieve this alignment. So when this is done properly, resilience design should be embedded within the main scope of the project rather than thought of as an additional design feature. And integration of the team and being aligned around the same goals early on will help achieve a work plan and job cost that is in line with any other traditional project. Next. Step 3 is all about identifying the hazards pertinent to the site and project and how to assess their impacts. So the key component of determining risk and vulnerability is exposure. We use the probability of hazards occurring and the magnitude of losses from those hazards to calculate the risk. And we can do this through the formation of hazard asset pairings. Next. Here we assess potential hazards that Gail brought up for the site and the associated impacts of the project assets. This process reveals which hazards are most important to account for in the design. Next. Once a hazard has been identified as a potential threat to the project, we then analyze it to determine its critical impacts. This chart shows how we consider the hazard's primary and secondary impacts to the site, building, people, and surrounding areas to identify key components for the project team to develop solutions for our next step. Next. Step 4 is where hazard assessment results from step 3 come in and connects them to design strategies of the project. During all this, there's a lot of information to consider, so it's really beneficial to incorporate the AIA framework for design excellence into the design process to help coordinate concepts across all 10 measures. Next. And approaching holistic and comprehensive ideas for effective resilience is really important and requires a multifaceted approach. So while developing solutions, you should consider these 7 topics important. Next. Integrating resilience strategies into a project relies on the use of a design integration feedback loop to develop design strategies, assess them with a benefit cost analysis, and then add them to a list of feasible options. During this, the team would repeat this process until the benefit cost ratio yields a positive performance, which we'll go through a little bit. Next. So here, these are the 5 steps to a benefit cost analysis, which evaluates the benefit of a solution with the cost to implement it. Up until right now, we have completed the first 4 steps, and then we will calculate the benefit cost ratio to determine the effectiveness. Next. If the benefit cost ratio is above 1, through all the math of it all, it's an effective solution. The BCR should be balanced by feasibility defined by the ability to incorporate the solution in the design and uphold the design intent. Next. And the final step focuses on the relationship with your client and the performance of the building and how it all comes together. So after the project is complete, you'll want to maintain the relationship with your client to evaluate your design. And after a disaster, you should follow up, see how everything held up and how your team can assist. Subsequently, both will inform you on solutions and innovations for other projects down the line. And another way you can always support communities in disaster events is to participate in the safety assessment programs that AIA hosts. So now I will pass it over to my colleague, Sammy Shams, to share a project we use the toolkit on.
Thank you, Amanda. So today I'm going to talk about the Wesley Chapel campus with the Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital based in St. Petersburg, Florida. Real brief on this one, we did a master plan for this group last year, and we did a resilience assessment with that. And this campus is a new community hospital based in Wesley Chapel, and we'll have a large facility there. And this is also a project that has gone through Hurricanes Helene and Milton this past year, that have influenced some of the process here. And so today we'll really get into the nuts and bolts on this process and build upon what Amanda, Aaron, and Gail have said earlier with these toolkits and resilience design. Next slide. So first off, we always want to be authentic and comprehensive on our approach to resilience and sustainability. Finding ways to be pragmatic and finding the true value of designs, what we're trying to do here with these types of projects. Next slide. And so at HKS, we developed this whole way of talking about this with our products called beepers. The thing that put you on your belt back in the 80s and 90s, but building performance, resilience, sustainability, how they work together to increase the resilience and sustainability of our projects using building performance. Next slide. And through this process, tools that we can use to help make this sort of come together and be succinct and streamline the approaches and owner's project requirements, where we ask the client about different topics they want to include in their project. What are their goals? What are the requirements that need to be in the project? And through this process, doing this in the beginning of the validation period of design and concept design, we can use assessment rubric to then assess these criteria and these objectives with an objective approach in the design process. Next slide. And as Amanda mentioned before, we do nature a place using the framework for design excellence, using these 10 specific measures to evaluate the place. We put this into integrative design charrette to have these conversations and develop the ideas and strategies in design. Next slide. And along the way, we can incorporate green building certifications, as Amanda mentioned before, the toolkit that includes some resilience pieces in the design part. And this all leads to a high value design. We're increasing resilience, increasing sustainability, and adding performance to the project. So this is the overall approach. And now I'll get into nuts and bolts of this project. Next slide. So this project, we started off in the validation period, understanding the site plan drivers. We had that initial OPR charrette with the client, and then we drilled into the nature of place, developed some concepts, and then we started to evaluate them through the building performance or the beepers lens that we talked about before. And this came into our schematic design period, which is actually going on right now. And the project is still in design and hopefully will be built in the next coming years. Next slide. And so the original way we got the juices flowing on our projects and our charrettes is have a stakeholder engagement here, understanding the measures of success. And so we look at these 5 major stakeholders for the project. We ask the project team, the client side, what would make success for these stakeholders in the project? Next slide. And this is what they said. We capture this live in the charrette, and we pull from these as ways to start to understand and ask the questions of the OPR for the project. And so you'll see things here as being very efficient with the money and the budget and the time, and looking for ways to increase the resilience of the project, adding patient and family experience features and whatnot. All these things help to drive the design of the project. Next slide. As I mentioned before, we do the measures of design excellence and the nature of place, and we use these 10 areas to understand the site, the people, and the place. Next slide. And I mentioned before, the strategy with the OPRs and understanding the building design strategies is a process that we use. And we use these spectrums, and on these spectrums, we'll have different strategies to talk about. And then you'll see these L, M, and H, so it's low, medium, high. It's at the range of where the project wants to aim for in these specific design strategies. And I'll show some examples here coming up. Next slide. So in this project, we use the design excellence measures to sort of ground them into a framework for these 10 areas. And this is an example here for greenhouse gas emissions and the energy measure for the framework design excellence. And here we set the range for like ASHRAE 90.1 improvement over code and embodied carbon reductions. And so you'll see here the low, medium, high where the project ended up with the conversations, and that D with the green is where we are currently in the design. Do a bit better than we wanted to over the code, but not enough where we wanted to be on the high side. So these are all questions that we have to ask during these charrettes. Next slide. Other ones look at building energy, like electrification, all electric building systems, natural gas connections, renewable energy. All these are different examples of how we can start to have these conversations, understand their goals and requirements, and impart those into the design process. Next slide. And then when we get into resilience, looking at ways to be more flexible in the building lifespan are also key questions I will ask the ownership team and the project team. And so you'll see here, as a hospital, we want some acuity adaptable rooms to be able to accommodate pandemics and those sort of emergencies that come up along the way. We also want to have an ability to accommodate other patients from other campuses in case there's a hurricane or a storm. And building lifespan is key as well. This will probably be a building that's going to be there for a long time. We design them for 60 to 100 years, but it'll probably be there longer. So we want to understand what that is now up front in the beginning of the project. Next slide. We also talk about inoperability and emergency power. This is a critical facility. And so the real answer for this top one, inoperability, is 0, because this is going to be operational all the time. And emergency power is something we always think about and want to increase that for projects that we don't know our future events that can happen and influence this facility. So we've always had some good conversations there about what time period to use. Next slide. And so this process starts with this OPR assessment and charrette, and then we start developing the strategies and designs. You see a little snippet here of a site plan that we have for this project. And then the end all of this is to take these ideas and vet them objectively with the criteria and assessment rubric that we have here, using weighted averages and levels of performance here to set goals and set performance ratings. Next slide. And so within this here, we also set up priorities for the project for sustainability and resilience outside of the design priorities to help guide this process some as well. So we want to make sure we use resources efficiently, enhance well-being, add some resiliency, and increase durability. And some of these will be more of a DD or design development level ideas and concepts, but we'll talk about them in expand design as well. Next slide. And so here's the process that we use to narrow down these strategies in the beginning. So we want to use resource efficiency, site well-being, and resilience to sort of capture the strategies, and then we'll take them into the objective process that we have here. Next slide. And so looking at the energy one again, this is one where we want it to be a bit better than National Input 1 in 2022, which was a future energy code for this part of Florida, and 10% improvement as a high goal. Next slide. And so this influenced the building form. So we worked with our mechanical engineer SSR to develop some ideas for form using the energy model, and the design team to understand how the patient rooms would flow with that. And we use the access from the cooling loads to guide that study. Next slide. And then we found some energy reduction strategies. We use this waterfall diagram to understand what the Meeting Hospital is, what the current state facilities are, and what these different types of strategies could be to reduce energy consumption, and using the OPR to guide some of those ideas moving forward. So you can see here energy reduction and the savings that we have with those, and a summary of all those improvements for the project being on the high side. Next slide. Then we take those strategies and put them into the site plan. And so we added some ideas for solar PV canopies over the garage and some parking, campus trail for some wellness, EV charging stations, respite areas. And the next slide. Next slide. And here you'll see some of the more resilient strategies that we have for stormwater management, potential flood impacts, articulation for daylighting, and storage for emergency materials and supplies in the building. Next slide. Next slide.
Sorry, the PowerPoint has frozen.
Oh, okay.
So let me see if I can stop sharing and then maybe reshare.
Oh, I might be pulling all those arrows and I didn't know we had those there. So yeah, click through those.
Oh, is that what's happening?
Yeah, I didn't notice those either.
Okay. Sorry about that.
No worries. That's my fault. So then we set up this rubric to assess these different strategies using criteria that we developed with the client. So we have some different types of strategies like economics, carbon, environmental, operational, the criteria there, and then the weighting here to sort of give some priorities over others based on the values of the client. And on the right-hand side in the colors, you see the performance of those strategies and where they would land on budget, costs, those kind of things there. And so we developed the strategy here to develop a scoring system for these strategies, and we can compare them objectively. Next slide. And here are some of the strategies that came through the initial vetting process, some of the scores that we have. And so we've taken these and you sort of see how we also organize them between resource efficiency, site and well-being, and organizing concepts. And that's how we sort of began to structure this process here. Next slide. And then the next part of this was to evaluate these strategies a little bit further. And so we looked at initial cost estimating for rough order of magnitude of cost, pros and cons and notable characteristics. Next slide. This for a few of them. This is applying the criteria objective assessment to these strategies and seeing what the scores were for each on the right-hand side. Next slide. And then we also go into some of these strategies a little bit further and deeper and understanding the one-line diagrams, understanding the components of these, as well as the rough order of magnitude of costs. Next slide. And then again, pros and cons, another example of the heat recovery system that also helps with energy and resilience. Next slide. And then also how that impacts the budget and the cost using the energy model. So now we're using building performance and resilience and sustainability in the same mind frame to sort of bring those all together. Next slide. And then we can compare different options within these strategies as well to really understand strategic focuses for heat recovery systems being just domestic hot water or a right-sized system for the whole campus, including some future growth. Next slide. And eventually we have a lot of strategies that we've gone through here that we studied, that we have decisions on with the client, help us give us a streamlined approach and direction on what to use. And so the ones that are considered yes are ones we take forward, the ones that are no, we take off the list and we stop working on those. And the ones that are maybe to keep moving them forward. This is a larger list that we had for this project. Next slide. And then at the end of this, we capture this all this information using an A3, where we look at what the background of the project is, the problem strategy is, the current state description of what's going on, the root cause of the evaluation and what the assumptions were, and then what the final results were. So we can document those decisions in design and help the client and the project team moving forward to know what was going on and be more efficient with it there. So I'll leave it here with this. This is just a very objective and technical approach, but an application of the Resilience Design Toolkit. And we also want to preface that this is different for every project. This is just one way of doing it. And you'll see many different ways of doing this with the future projects we'll see here. And ones in the future as well. This is a developing process that's agile and efficient and really wants to be what you want to make out of it. So you can make it and change it however you want to. But this is just one way of looking at it. And I'll pass it on to the next person. Thank you.
Okay, I want to drill down a little bit and talk about another aspect of resiliency that impacts work that people working in affordable housing have to deal with, and it's specific to sort of the convergence between climate resiliency and economic resiliency. So I'm Tim Coat. I work for National Community Renaissance. We're a developer builder of affordable housing, servicing mostly Southern California. We have some footprint in Texas, which is growing, footprint in Florida, which is also growing, but the case study here is going to be specific to what we're doing here in California. Next slide, please. And, you know, I say that this is, you know, a guide for California and beyond, and it's really about economics and technology and sort of leaning into the future, which I will get to in just a bit. Next slide. And next slide. So AIA, the 2030 challenge is kind of second nature to what we do. Next slide. National Corps is the first non-architectural entity to actually sign on to the 2030 commitment. We did this about 6 years ago because we hire architects and development teams and engineers to design and build our projects. And we believe that there is great value in making sure that we hit these targets. We feel like there's economic opportunity for us both upfront and then long-term with operations. So making a commitment and then dragging the architects that we work with into the 2030 challenge and the 2030 commitment has been sort of a cornerstone of what we do. Next slide. So the other thing that we do is we build everything based on the LEED for Homes standard. We're building affordable multifamily. We use LEED for Homes as our foundation. We've been recognized as a power builder, sort of an elite group, recognized by the USGBC for going above and beyond what people normally do. We've been on the list 6 years in a row. I think we're the only repeat recipient on this, and we are the only nonprofit on that list. Next slide. So what I want to emphasize with this is this is what I would call the secret sauce to build high performance, cost contained, affordable housing. And it all centers on understanding the economics. And you know, despite the apparent political turmoil that we're living through right now, I'm extremely optimistic because I've always been sort of a libertarian and a capitalist when I attack this problem. I'm an environmentalist, don't get me wrong, but when I look at this, it's always a numbers game, dollars and cents. And we've seen the cost of solar dropping steadily, and it continues to drop. This slide is called the Swanson effect, that says that every time that worldwide capacity to manufacture polycrystalline panels doubles, the cost drops 20%. And it's really, you know, an interesting graph, but I work on the general contractor side for the developer builder, and we are buying solar all the time, and we see this ongoing. We see the prices dropping, which drives our decision making. Next slide. And it continues. So I think this slide, the last one I could find from the EIA, I think is where I got this slide from, was from 2022. But the cost continues to go down. It will continue to go down. I think there'll be discussions of tariffs and things like that that could drive it up. The last time there were tariffs on Chinese panels, we were a little bit nervous, but we saw the market quickly stabilize and the costs continue to drop. Cost for labor is going to be fixed, but we've hit this point of grid parity. The time at which it's actually cheaper to drop in renewable energy onto your project than it is to tie it in to the utility grid. We hit that point about 2018 or so, and we never looked back. Next slide. So this is really important to us because we build a lot of, you know, affordable housing. We're building a lot of housing right now, which is for the formerly homeless. And we were really deep into the long-term implications of operating these buildings. And there's incentives to be had out there, and there's also the competing costs of electricity from the utility grid. This is Greenbrier Village, sort of an example. It's 51 units of housing for the formerly homeless down in Oceanside. Next slide. We finished this one earlier this year. You sort of see in process on the right. You see the layout on the left that we're going towards, and in process on the right. But we were leveraging SOMA, Solar on Multifamily Affordable Housing, and SCHIP on this one to bring the cost of solar down to us to zero, because we're an affordable housing developer. And we get into solar service agreements with our partners on this. We work primarily with Sunrun, who brings us federal tax credits, 50% tax credits, SOMA rebates, and then they're selling renewable energy credits. So the cost for solar to put this on our buildings is zero. And we don't own it. We are essentially leasing it long-term. So if it breaks, somebody else has to fix it, Sunrun in this case. And if they don't fix it, then they pay us a penalty, a performance guarantee lies on each of these projects. So $0, 0 cents per kilowatt hour is our rate for electricity on this. And that's important when we look at the operational economics of this. Next slide. And this is the analysis that I will go through. I immediately take energy analysis and energy modeling directly into an economic tool. I use Energy Toolbase. Next slide. And Energy Toolbase allows us basically to identify the upfront costs, and then the slide on the right, the shot on the right, is the avoided cost of utilities. And here I threw in a 30-year conventional loan and showed that, you know, the project's going to get to, you know, 80–90% of what it needs with renewable energy on site, but our long-term operational savings for this are going to be in excess of $2 million. That's a big deal for a 51-unit project that's housing for the formerly homeless. These things operate on shoestrings budgets. Next slide. So shifting slightly on this, it's not just economic resilience, we're also interested in climate resilience. So what we do in our process is, for these communities, we like to build in some place where residents can go in the event of an emergency. The utility grid goes down for whatever it is. There's a catastrophic fire, there's an earthquake or something like that. So this is a diagram of where the community room is at Greenbrier Village. Next slide. And what I do with the energy modeling process is you can see that middle sort of shot. I've identified a whole bunch of utility meters inside of my energy analysis, my energy modeling tool, which is ISVE. And the shot on the right is identifying the worst day for energy performance and how many kilowatt hours or kilowatts per hour I'm going to need out there. So I can start to think about how big the battery needs to be. Next slide. And if I look at that energy curve for that worst day, I can see that, you know, my peak demand out here is going to be hovering around 17 kilowatts for those critical loads areas, the community room, the offices. I only want a battery that's going to service those spaces. In an emergency, residents will go into those spaces. They have some place to put their medicine and a refrigerator that's on. They have some place to plug in their cell phones. The air conditioner will be operating. All I want to do is size the battery to get me through 4 or 5 hours in the evening when residents can then go home and open the windows and hunker down. Next slide, please. So the analysis here for us from this end is how much battery do I need? There's rebates out there that are going to get me the battery for free. And how am I going to get through the evening hours? So red line here is building operational energy. The blue line is energy from PV. And the green line is energy that's deposited and then withdrawn from the battery. So what I want to see when I'm doing this, I want to see a little bit of margin as I go into the evening hours so I can get into late into the evening. I don't necessarily need to be there 24/7 with this, but a portion of my PV system is now going to be wired to my battery so that every single day this thing is charging and discharging. So that in the event of an earthquake, I've got a place for people to go. Take this idea, go to the next slide. Take this idea, and if we can leverage, and the next slide, what we're doing here for new construction projects. This is a similar project, Rose Creek Village Villas. It's 60 units of housing for the formerly homeless, also in San Diego. Go through the next 2 slides in sequence. You can sort of see there's no surface parking here. There's no room for carports, just a couple of parking spaces here. So the diagram on the left is what we would typically do. Give me some rooftop solar, but it's a 5-story building. And I'm only going to get to about 40–50% of my total energy needs from the rooftop. So, and the solar for us is free. So what do we need to do next to create greater climate resiliency? Next slide. I do the analysis, and SOMA and SCHIP are going to pay for my solar as long as it generates electricity. It's free to me. So I jump in and I give this diagram to our architects, in this case, Studio E down in San Diego, and I say, we want something like this. Can you give me something like this to create greater economic stability and resiliency for us? And next slide, please. And in the hands of the right architect, they make something that looks truly spectacular, can go above and beyond what normal people's expectations are. Next slide. And when I look at my renewable energy picture, I can see that my solar PV is here making up 100% of my building load. I've got a little bit negative, might have a battery, a EV charge or something like that. And I found a way to actually pay for it. Go to the next slide. Performance of this is, you can see, like in the early months, that low sun is hitting that facade solar pretty hard. We're generating a lot of electricity, throwing it into the grid. We're using NEM 2 tariffs because we're affordable housing, so we get to export at about 20–25 cents a kilowatt hour. And in the summertime when it's high, rooftop solar and some oblique angle sun hitting the facade solar. Next slide, please. And then operationally, here's what it looks like. Next slide. Ties right into it. $127,000 based on today's cost to operate this building. Next slide. And when we're done with this and we add the facade solar and the rooftop solar, we get our operating costs down to about $4,000 a year. Next slide. So that's $123,000 a year in savings. And most importantly for us, because we're operating affordable housing for a long period of time, go to the next slide. What does this look like over just 15 years, the 15-year life of a tax credit, relationship? That's $1.8 million based on today's utility rates and avoided utility costs. This is where the money hits the decision making. This is driving design conversation up front, creating greater resiliency operationally for us. building in other things like the battery storage that's going to service the community room and the offices in the event of a power outage or something like that. But more than anything, we get to a different type of architecture that speaks the language of resiliency. Next slide. And to steal a line from Eric Naslund from Studio E, he calls this an architecture of hope, right? And which is really important in the climate that we're living in now. I think with the climate crisis and the political, landscape that we're living in, it's really important to keep an eye on this stuff because I'm convinced that economics will carry the day. Now I'll hand it off to the next presenter.
Thank you, Tim. What's been great about the conversation so far that you've heard from my colleagues is both process, practice, outcomes. And what I'd like to share is a mini case story of kind of an everyday building. It's not, as Sammy was talking about, a really important for resilience and sustainability resource use healthcare facility. It's certainly not as vital as housing that we all know, every one of us at different economic scales, not only have to have a place to live of quality health and affordability, but something that can resist the challenges that climate and other economic headwinds share with or send us. This is an interesting project in Texas along the Gulf Coast, about 60 miles from the Gulf Coast, that, like Gail's fun introduction, has survived in the last year all of those challenges and is still thriving. A couple things before I get into the details. This is going to be a fast overview of both the process, but actually the behavior, the operations, and the outcomes, and where they're going next. This is a client that chose the firm Gensler, where I'm a principal, to work with them, not only because we were local, and in fact, I'd had a previous research relationship with this research organization. It's the Houston Area Research Center, but also they were impressed by, as you've heard with these great colleagues, there's a lot of research behind designing for sustainability, climate neutrality, and resilience. And in fact, in this case, regeneration. And that's the great story. The partnership was based on, as a research organization, learning to make decisions with facts, scientific analyses, and understanding, like you've heard really from my colleagues, computational analytics and other ways to make better decisions on what was not only a building delivered ahead of schedule in a very challenging economic environment of the mid-teens. So this project's now 10 years old, but it was brought in at roughly 10 to 15% below market costs for a not high performance building, but for a building of this size. It's about 19,000 square feet, 2 stories in the Woodlands, Texas. Let's go to the next slide. This is about, exactly as Sammy noted, making decisions early. Here's the metrics. The idea from the beginning and working with the client through an owner's program requirement process, exactly, starting from the beginning, was to identify with a limited budget, a not-for-profit organization, who could rely a little bit on the founder, George Mitchell, yes, oil and gas, moving to sustainability leader, a limited building budget, but even more constricted operating budget. The real conundrum tends to be when we build for many organizations, we don't ask the question, so how do you intend to operate it? This is an organization that's lean, does not have a facility manager or fancy managers of large buildings that can constantly tweak and recommission. This was a building that really needed to be almost off, what I want to say, off the usual, move in and keep tweaking it. This is a building that had very interested scientists, researchers, and engineers who took it upon themselves to really allow for fine-tuning the behavior as well as some of the interesting components of the building. So it was a very collaborative process from the beginning, involving deep investigations of how the workplace and the research environment need to be supported in a variety of ways that you've heard about. But also notice that early on, in partnership with CMTA, our engineers who have a track record around both net zero energy, and therefore net zero carbon in our part of the world, and all electric building, and renewable approaches, but also geothermal approaches, and looking at the entire site in partnership with the client and our landscape engineer as a regenerative, restorative approach, which in fact is going to be a very important concept through this discussion here in the next few minutes. So next slide. So it took a team approach with a client who is definitely aligned, and you can see in the OPR from day one, much of the sustainability goals obviously have come to very much support the resiliency goals or the resilience goals. This project, in terms of measures of success as a not-for-profit, part of the measure of success was not only a cost-effective delivery, but an operational optimization that would reduce the cost of energy, the cost of water, the cost of maintenance through the right choice of everything from orientation, future solar photovoltaics, which didn't come about, site stewardship, daylight, things you've heard already. But this was from the very beginning. This allowed us to create, in partnership with an early partnership with the contractor, Brookstone, to basically truly value engineer and prioritize what would make sense as initial schematic design to align with the budget and align with the owner's needs. From the very beginning, certification, third-party certification was a nice to have. It is a LEED Platinum building, but in fact, what we were very much focusing on was true performance measurements, indicators that we agreed upon early, the EUIs, the durability of facade, and I will come back to the importance of the enclosure, days in operation. One of the biggest issues we face with resilience that folks have noted previously, we're not facing, but for the challenge, say, of the wildfires where destruction occurs, our challenges, except perhaps along the coast, are interruptions of business, interruptions of quality of life. Can't get kids to school, therefore suffering education. But the conundrum tends to be an interruption rather than the end of property, end of life, which of course we probably will face. So looking at this in the previous and frankly, since this was completed, challenges, it really has been how fast can you get back to business? In Texas, the majority of the firms, private, public, et cetera, not for profit, I'm not talking university systems, are small businesses. More than 5 days of not being in business means bankruptcy. Some of the biggest insurance losses around our challenges have been business interruption insurance. So one of the main measurements was how can this be a good place to work regardless of what's happening with climate, with weather, et cetera. Next slide. Obviously, as a small organization, they're very much focusing on how they could right size. And so, in fact, from a previous firm's programming design, we reduced the size of the building by almost 25%, right sizing it. The building is surrounded by the woodlands, or the woods of the woodlands. This site has been historically both tree harvesting, oil drilling, cattle raising, mineral culling, and surprisingly explosion element testing for oil and gas. So it's had quite an interesting site. From the beginning, the restoration of what still is indigenous, what is basically prairie and northern prairie woodlands of this part of Houston. Houston has quite the diverse geography, topography, geology. Was very important. And so all that was rainwater and other things connected to our natural hydrology was not used in the building, but rather to restore and maintain this campus. Even with our droughts, this appropriately indigenous or autochthonous landscape, overhead, ground cover, middle story, is thriving. The water from the fixtures is not used here. That would have involved an amazingly complex code requirement. However, what we did, of course, use is reduce and kind of limit the quantity of water used in the fixtures, et cetera. So the water story is kind of a quiet one, but in fact, it's really the power and the resilient power story that's the question here. In looking at the site, you can see the orientation of the building is to the south. And so what is an early photograph of a preliminary solar photovoltaic that would accommodate base building needs, not accommodating the actual user. You'll see in subsequent shots that PV field has more than trebled through donations, partnerships with Sun Texas and other organizations, so outside the original cost. They're investigating, as you'll see at the end of this, the future of batteries. When we started, the battery technology was not really accessible. Underneath this parking lot, limited, and it's not permeable for a number of reasons, but in fact, it catches water and sheds it to bioswales. But underneath this parking lot is 30 geothermal wells that provide the enthalpy cooling for both dehumidification of outside air in our hot and humid climate, as well as circulation air through a series of small-scale heat pumps. Not quite residential heat pump scales, but certainly not at large, complex heat pump scales. The heat pumps are affordable and multiplied, redundant, so that if one goes down, that engineers can quickly, at this organization, figure out what to do, being the engineers focused. Next slide. Because of our focus on the really tight envelope, and again, you're seeing orientation is facing roughly south, the idea was to not only dramatically reduce the typical kBTU per square foot of an all-electric building from a typical Houston hot, humid, cooling climate focus dramatically from a standard of 85 to 95 kBTU per square foot. Our design of daylight is light, a tight envelope, looking at process loads, things like the elevatoring, the data center, et cetera, reduced our kBTU down to roughly 18 to 15 kBTU per square foot. That then could be the difference accommodated by the solar photovoltaics. Next slide. Back to the landscape briefly, you can see the autochthonous or indigenous planting. It was a restoration partnership with HARC and our landscape architects creating outdoor spaces. This building from the beginning did choose not to have operable windows. Part of that is through resilience strategy. Hurricanes both create problems with operable windows. Also the pressure differential that comes across with our derechos and other direct, both straight line and not straight line winds can pull operable windows apart. That's a big issue, how we make our window systems thermally broken. That's a problem with our pressure differential that comes with these weather. So from the beginning, we asked these questions. Where are the cost effective, not per se added cost, though clearly the PV and all this connected to renewable became good to have with partnerships elsewhere. But the base building really looked for a durable skin, looked for a way using that geothermal and that tight skin to minimize the air exchange or air loss through infiltration, which I'll talk about in a minute. But again, it's surrounded by a cooling environment. Unlike most of our office buildings or other retail in this climate, we chose not to surround it with a typical asphalt parking lot or other heated flatscape spaces. Next slide. And again, you look out the windows and see nature. The other important component about this building, and this is a fun kind of shot out of order perhaps, but this building is an educational building. Its programming from day one was not only supporting research, but become a place at night and on weekends, not quite 24/7 use, but almost 18 hours a day, 6 days a week use of community groups and environmental groups, not only using the space, but learning about the building's efficiency. To date, after not quite 8 years of operation of this building has had over 7,000 visiting groups looking at how this building gets to net zero and as well as how it has survived so well in the challenges that are our climate, resiliency or otherwise. Next slide. And once again, aligning with their mission, as you can see, the idea was focusing not just on using less energy, but it was the indoor air quality. And once again, the resilience, providing science-based resilience solutions, not only applicable to this fairly small, not pedantic, but this is an everyday building. It's not a fancy building with fancy widgets, but one could say perhaps for the PVs. Geothermal is used a lot and has been in this part of the world. The enthalpy exchange you'll see in a minute perhaps is a bit unique, but it's approachable, affordable by this scale of a building, but it's become a resource for people to understand what worked. If you'd like, you can go on the HARC website, Google their buildings, their dashboard is public. How does it work day in and day out with the different kinds of climatic challenges? Too hot, too cold, no water, too much water, freezing, snow, that was last week. It's all database shared. Next slide. The triple bottom line, this is very fast. This is exactly what Sammy was talking about in terms of the process to understand how to get there. The organization, this not-for-profit, decided in partnership with us to spend a bit more time in the design, which of course, if you look at the scale of building, its operational cost is fractional. That's the real story here, is to convince and show your client that a little bit of planning, a little bit of design thought or optioneering, scenario thinking can really pay for itself. And this client to date is saying that we made decisions based on look at scenarios. Our engineers looked at different mechanical systems, DOAS versus heat pump versus geothermal, and we made the decisions through collaboration based on what works for the long term with an organization that's not full of facility operators, but interested scientists in a climate that is constantly changing. With, by the way, a grid in Texas, if you're not familiar with ERCOT, that until recently was eschewing renewables, now is broadly grasping and holding on to the renewable capability, but the distribution of which is a challenge. Our distribution is always an issue. So having this building, even with a modicum of solar photovoltaics, to stand alone, even with some of the hookup and online challenges we face in Texas is an objective for that resilience, or at least business minimization interruption. Next slide. And behind all of this, of course, is the quality of the working environment. We had a great partnership with that Brookstone contracting group. We actually had not one, but several bring your kids to see the construction site afternoons. You'll also get to see that this is a steel stud building. The metal outside is a Galvalume-based off-the-shelf product. It's not a fireproof, but a highly fire-resistant building, even before Houston became ranked, or Harris County became ranked in the top 3 to 4 fire-prone, wildfire-prone municipalities. This building, just through smart approaches, starting early, not spending more, but looking closely at design, has responded to and can respond to a lot of the uncertainties and weather-based, challenges we might face here. Next. And I'll go through it pretty quickly. Floodplains. Oh, yes, we get our torrential downpours. In fact, this weekend we had, in about a 4-hour period of time, between 3 and 8 inches of rain across the Houston area. Though not near any sort of estuaries, rivers, or creeks, the way we work is primarily flood zones, or bayou systems with catchment areas. And so we're looking at backup of overland water flow. So it's not really flood. It's more like when it rains, where does it flow? At the beginning, we not only made sure that the site was high and dry in the final selection, a purchase or a repurchase actually of the territory of a community college you see to the left. The territory was all at once part of the Mitchell Foundation, etc. But we also made this building have no foundation. The building is on a structural slab that is elevated for the most part about 2.5 feet above the surrounding area. So with some of these super rainstorms that flow down to that blue area, we didn't have any problem. Parking underground, so be it. Geothermal, not a problem underwater. The building itself stayed high and dry. Next slide. And this all comes back to the conversation that's really important, which is understanding the climate and its impact on the site. I've mentioned a lot of this already. This is good resources as an example of that regeneration of site. Next slide. The idea of maintaining as much permeable and natural surfaces as possible for that regeneration, even if it meant kind of a circuitous route to get in. We minimized or reduced the impact of the facilities and parking on champion trees, on historic trees and historic woodland areas. And included, you see in the upper left-hand side, an assessment of what was sensitive habitat. We did our best to thread the needle here. Next slide. So just finally, before I go to kind of like the big summary, the building envelope, this is a rain screen technology that frankly should be universal in application. Somewhat challenging when you look at the actual insulation and its flammable or fire issues internally. It's something that, were we to be again, we'd probably look closely at that Dow Thermax insulation. It does meet the standards. Could we be better, both in terms of if they're embers, hot embers, or otherwise for fire? Nonetheless, what this does is create a thermal break, very high, almost in doing the blower door test, this building is about 2 times the passive house requirements in terms of tightness, which means our hot, humid air full of mold, mildew, dust, etc., does not find its way into the building with all the major entries with, vestibules. It also means that the hot Galvalume does not translate its heat into the building, and that little air sort of chimney helps cool the Galvalume and keep the building tight. And as such, we reduced dramatically the air exchange. Well, we changed the air, but we reduced dramatically the amount of energy to dehumidify, as well as change the air through using the geothermal heat pump approach to pre-treat the air, as well as using enthalpy exchange as we release the air. So a combination of an extremely tight envelope, very resilient, withstanding the threats I've mentioned from, too much rain, hurricanes, derechos, and so forth, as well as taking care of the, extended over 100-degree days. So that envelope choice, the orientation, the window is as daylight, high performance double pane glazing, not triple, double made sense with our climate. The orientation of the roof, all Galvalume, easy to clip those PVs on. We maintain the integrity of the roof, even adding these things. That was the really key driver. That was the aha moment for us, is how important that roof was to the net zero approach, looking at, yes, some of the carbon impact of the materiality, both of the steel structure and here, ultimately being offset by the solar photovoltaics and the full array in about 10 to 15 years. So getting to a carbon zero relative to material base or major systems also. Next, and you can see the R50 is perhaps an overkill, but it made sense to us. Here's the general target of cost per year of a 20,000 square foot building. That, in fact, to say confirming, it's now been reduced by half by new behavior, new protocols, etc. I'm just watching the time, so I'm just going to go skip the next couple. If we go to the next one, that's the original PV array. It's now more than tripled, again, through a partnership and rebate program that over the last 4 years of the Biden administration has been very helpful, even here in Texas, with some great partners. Next slide. Obviously, the no-brainer here, daylight is the light sensors, constant commissioning of the sensoring devices based on the tree growths and things around it. We're trying to make sure that the landscape, the site continues to be biodiverse, et cetera, but that has implications on daylighting and the PVs. That is a bit of a maintenance factor that our client is coming to grips with, is how to keep the site not getting in the way of daylight is the light in our solar photovoltaics. Shading is important, however, of course. Next. And once again, tracking, constant, not only data analysis on their part, learning how to tweak their behaviors, finding lights that stay on. Do we really need 3 coffee makers? And that reprographics machine seems to be running hot. I mean, they're down to looking at the plug loads and other things because they're passionate, but they have the data, the measurements, the tools, the metrics to see how they're operating. And they've looked at that implication when it comes to the challenges that come with, say, the grid operations or others during our weather-based challenges. Next slide. And you can see the dramatic reduction of, not only the demand of the energy and that PV partnership has increased since this was delivered about this slide about 5 years ago. Next slide. Geothermal 101, you understand, I'm sure. You can see the 300 or 36 wells at 300 foot deep. There's actually 30 operating with several backups. Redundancy was key in our client's mind. Next. And, I've said it repeatedly, lots and lots of assessment tools on their part. Their organization, as a research organization, has been hired by county, city, regional organizations to look at facilities, to coach their own facility teams. So in some ways, they are coaches through their own building of other successful projects in the public realm and a few private realm. And as I said, a lot of our corporate campus facility folks at the launch of projects have come to visit this small but nonetheless impactful project about lessons learned, which there's been many. Next slide. A lot of publications. CMTA, the engineers have continued to do research and commissioning with them to optimize. It's now a LEED Zero project certified. It continues to look at other opportunities for resilience certifications, particularly as it moves to look at battery technology, not to be totally off grid, but to be less grid dependent, particularly on the challenging times that ERCOT says our power is about to have problems on the grid across Texas, the independent Texas grid. Next slide. And this is, I think, where they're coming next. They're looking at more of the methodologies for managing the building, IoT, Internet of Things, that is, the smart building. There's opportunities, too, in partnership with many of their research organizations, looking at microgrids, but also identifying ways to capture waste energy. And that's more to come. But the idea is this organization still partners with us, partners with the consultants and others to see how they can optimize this building. Next slide. And this is the dashboard I mentioned. This is a snapshot of a while ago, but you can get real-time analytics of where the building is. That is both their own tool, but also for those following it. Many students of mine, for example, all looking at the implications of, what does each day, each challenge of weather mean for the basic infrastructure and energy use? And I think at that stage, we're really out of time. So I'll wrap it up. Again, a great client, just like you've heard from my colleagues, Tim and his assessment of operational computational analytics, looking at energy, looking at the climate, it all works together early in the process to get a project that the client shows off as a both net zero sustainable project, but also a resilient project. So with that, my end. And Gail, what's next?
So I think we have time for some Q&A, and I guess a couple of things. There's several questions that have come in, and one via the chat, and a number of questions that weren't answered. But first of all, I'd like to ask, so I think this question is for everyone, everyone on the panel. Do most, and I mean most, like 70% or more of your clients understand the concepts of shelter in place, passive survivability, and operations continuity? And if they do they typically ask you to design projects to provide these features? So I'm going to just jump in and say, let's see, let's go to Sammy first.
So I would say, I think the way our clients understand that is different place to place. They may understand the terms, but the way they approach it are very different. When we have a healthcare client, shelter in place is pretty much required, right? So in case something bad happens, they have to be able to do that by code, by FGI, by ACRA, all those kind of things. And I think when it comes to the design, sometimes they expect that. And so with resilience, sometimes you'll see is that they expect these types of things to be included in the project. But other times you look at like a hotel or a commercial building or something like that, the whole premise there will change. And say like an office building, something bad happens, everyone goes home. That's it. So the spectrum of how we approach those changes from project to project. And I think the key thing to do early on a project is understand where your client understands those, so you can really understand how to approach that subject with them. Because if their understanding is way different from what you have, it's good to align on that. And I think that's critical to that piece of this project. Hopefully that answers your question.
I'll also ask Aaron to weigh in.
There we go. You know, it really varies pretty widely with clients. I think that our office has started doing a lot more work in the Southeast and East Coast, and so shelter in place and some of those pieces are starting to be discussed a lot more. For us, most of our work historically has been in California, and it's been largely focused on power outage, heat, wildfire, and I think the thing that we struggle with the most around continuity is really setting those loads and deciding what to prioritize when you're looking at a power outage scenario. And there are things that would be really nice to have, like the elevator and HVAC systems, but the draw from those, the battery sizing, it's the trade-off. And so we have a lot of really detailed conversations about what is ideal and what's critical, and then work with the engineers and try to sort of find that sweet spot to meet those priorities. But I think that's sort of the hardest one. I think Tim gave a pretty simple response to that as far as just prioritizing like your evening peak loads and working from there. But I think we see a lot of clients that really have a lot of goals, a lot of things they would love to do, and then it's a trade-off getting to what's achievable for a project.
Great reality check. So Tim, actually, this is something that came up in the chat. It's a question on success regarding pushback on operable windows for extreme heat resilience. And I could go on about this for ages, but I won't, because you have some experience in this. I'd like to actually have you answer that. So typically, or specifically rather, the question was, any success with others push towards operable window conversations for extreme heat resilience? Typically, the speaker gets pushback on having operable rather than fixed windows. This is from Jennifer.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, for us, as we operate the buildings, our property management team has basically said they don't want operable windows at the community rooms because they're most concerned about long-term security and break-ins. So what we try to do is enough controllable openings. We want to maximize, I want community rooms with big French doors that can swing open, or big sliding doors that I can control, that I can lock down. And we think that this idea, this approach, and I heard this, coming out of Greenbuild conversations, Atelier 10 is really pushing this idea of being radically passive, and we are all in on that. We want to build as much passive opportunity for our residents and our community spaces as possible, we can't take battery storage into residential units in most cases in California. We've got to limit the battery. You only have enough space in an affordable housing footprint. You're only going to have room probably for battery size large enough to service a community room and some offices. So if they have a destination that they can go to where they can charge a phone, get signal, find news, have a TV on, that's the starting component for us, but it goes hand in hand like that, operating energy systems in that space, that goes in hand with trying to reduce the energy loads as much as possible. If it's nice, you need to open the doors and keep the air conditioner off and use it only when you need to. So for us, it's very much a stepped approach, but it's all based on, operational resilience first with the economics. And then second is just providing some safe haven space on site, because that is already a significant shift for the affordable housing industry. I know that others are looking at battery storage. I don't think in the affordable housing industry, from my conversations, Aaron, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're one of the few that's really kind of defined this way of battery lives alone. It's charged by a little bit of your isolated rooftop solar, and it's charging and discharging on a daily basis. And then you get the solar for the rest of the building that's tied to the grid that goes dark in the event of a power outage.
And I will just add, passive house is great, but the reality check, if people have to shelter in place, as you point out, Tim, and they cannot get a window open, that's a death trap. And it's just something for your clients to bear in mind. If they're going to leave the building because it's an office and they're not going to stay there, it's not an issue. But if it's an issue where people are going to die, think about, your clients, their occupants, and your reputation too, for that matter.
Not even passive house, just code regularly insulated current code buildings with the wrong solar orientation without any operable windows, it gets hot without any sun shading. So yeah.
Oh, you're on mute, yeah.
Oh, this is specifically for Reeves. Did you use the principles of passive house for the HARC envelope?
In effect, we did. The colleague who was responsible for that had a passive house education. We used the blower door test, which is a pretty standard approach. Before we finished all of the Galvalume overclad, we tested the tightness of the both rigid and blown-in insulation and the tightness, et cetera. So yes, it was. Though of course that's tough in Houston for the very reasons we've just talked about, which is sometimes you do need that fresh air. However, back to the hurricane issues with operable windows, we learned the hard way with some testing. But yes, passive house was something that drove this building and its envelope cross-section in particular.
And I see we only have 3 minutes left. So Sarah, I'm going to just wrap up really quickly, and then you can give everybody the information to make sure they get their credits, because that has been a question that's been coming up as well, critically. So, well, in closing, as one of my favorite proverbs says, everybody gets tired of me quoting this, but the best day to plant a tree is 40 years ago, but the second best day is today. We are where we are. There's no sugarcoating it. The situation is dire. So failure on climate change action isn't an option, but we as architects have incredible agency and skills to both mitigate and adapt the built environment to climate change. So we have the responsibility to exercise that agency and those skills. And the AIA definitely has lots of resources to help us. So let's get out there and plant that tree today. Thank you, Sarah.
Awesome. Thank you so much to Gail and to all of our panelists today for such a really in-depth, important conversation on resilience. If you've made it this far, AIA California will submit you for AIA credit, and we'll be sending a follow-up email where you can also request a certificate of completion for today. Thanks again for everyone being here, and we hope to see you at our next AIA California webinar. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Mm-hmm.